Hello and welcome. I'm Roger Ream, and this is the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, a conversation with TFAS alumni who are making a real impact in politics, public policy, government, business, philanthropy, law, and the media. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Bobby Tudor, CEO of Artemis Energy Partners and retired founder and CEO of Tudor, Pickering, Holt & Company, a widely recognized company for energy investment banking. When it comes to energy practice, Bobby is an expert. Bobby and I will chat today about his work at Goldman Sachs in the field of energy investment banking and his role in helping Houston become a leader in the global energy transition. We'll also talk some about his work at the Houston Energy Transition Initiative. And perhaps, if we have time, we'll hear about his career in the world of basketball, both in college and as a professional. Bobby, thanks for joining me. I'm looking forward to catching up.
My pleasure, Roger. Very happy to be here.
Well, in knowing about your career and in the various things you've done throughout your life, the word that just blares out loudly is success. You had success at Rice academically and in sports, in basketball in particular, success in Goldman Sachs and in your investment banking career. It's something that makes us proud since you're a TFAS alum, and we hope that we played some small role in that direction. But let's talk a little bit about your time at Rice as a basketball player. How do you hear about the Fund for American Studies when you were there?
I think I saw it pinned up on a bulletin board in career services or something like that. I was interested in a summer program. When you're a college athlete, your summers are pretty occupied actually, because you spend the whole time training, and it wasn't really until my final summer that I had enough of a break to do something like that. And I wanted to do an internship. I wanted to do it in Washington, D.C. I was interested in politics generally. I was planning on going to law school. It all just seemed like a good fit to me. And oh, by the way, my girlfriend now wife, was going to spend the summer in Washington, D.C. as well. So it was all a scheme to get there. And it was a well-known program at Rice. Had a couple of folks kind of a year or two ahead of me who had gone to the program and had a good experience. And I had a buddy, Kyle Frazier, who was going to do it with me. And so we signed up and spent the summer in Washington, and I had a great experience.
Do you keep in touch with any others who did the program that year?
Yeah, I do. In particular, a good friend, Ron Hart, who I met that summer and have had a lifelong friendship with. And Ron actually was an important kind of intro to me to Goldman Sachs. Actually, he was there a year ahead of me, and in a different part of the business, but he helped me get my first interview actually. And so those TFAS connections have been valuable to me over the course of my life and career.
Well, we appreciate your support of our scholarship programs, just as we appreciate the support of Ron Hart too, who served a term on our board of trustees and continues to be a supporter and friend. Well, after Rice, you attended law school and then joined Goldman Sachs. That in and of itself is, I guess, not the usual career track. You think about people going out of business school to Goldman Sachs. Tell us about that decision to go into investment banking. When did you get an interest in that profession?
Well, I went to law school thinking I probably would be a lawyer, but not 100% sold on that. I felt like a legal education was going to be a good postgraduate degree in any case. But I did what typical law students do, which is I clerked for a range of law firms during my law school years, both during the summers and during the school year, and ultimately just couldn't find a law firm that I loved, and finally decided the issue wasn't necessarily the law firm. The issue was I didn't fundamentally love being a lawyer, though I enjoyed law school very much. And so I decided to change course and look around. My wife wanted to go to graduate school, and the best program in the country in what she was studying, which was architectural historic preservation, was at Columbia in New York. And we decided just to take a flyer, and we are going to move to New York, and I was gonna figure it out. So I had a friend who had spent the previous summer he was at Harvard Business School and spent the previous summer at Goldman Sachs, and he said, "Man, this is fun. You should take a look at investment banking." And I started to nose around that and decided that it actually would be a good fit for my interest and skills, and kind of decided to bootstrap my way into a job. So I got on a plane and went to New York and slept on a friend's couch for a few days and knocked on doors at DLJ and Solomon Brothers and Goldman Sachs. And my friend Ron Hart was helpful in me getting my first interview at Goldman Sachs as well. And ultimately got offered jobs at all three places, and chose Goldman, and we moved to New York and from New Orleans in 1987. I joined the corporate finance department. It was a little bit of an unusual track, but not completely unusual at Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs has had three of the last, five CEOs have been lawyers by training. Bob Rubin was a lawyer. Lloyd Blankfein was a lawyer. Steve Friedman was a lawyer. And in my entering class at Goldman, if there were 30 or so of us in the corporate finance department, I think there were 5 or 6 with law degrees. So it wasn't hugely unusual. And actually, I think that legal training is great for a business career, and in particular in the investment banking and deal world, where there's a lot of integration between finance and the law.
Yeah, well, I confess that my father, who was a minister, graduated with a law degree before going into the ministry, and
Well, there you go.
he always talked about how legal training was valuable in the ministry as well. So it has many applications. You spent some time at Goldman Sachs. I imagine that was total immersion into the world of high finance and investment banking. Did you eventually get a focus on energy while you were there, or was that your?
When I started in the late 80s, there wasn't a huge amount of industry specialization, really. If you were a corporate finance banker, you might work on a financial institution one day and a consumer company the next day and an energy company the next day. That obviously is very different to today, but when I started, that was sort of the norm. And as fate would have it, I was staffed on a energy project early on, and you learn one industry, and so you get staffed on the next project and you get staffed on the next project. The fact that I had gone to college in Texas probably helped, because a lot of those companies were in Texas, and so I was sort of a natural fit for that. And the more I worked in the business, the more I liked it. And also the investment banking world started to trend towards specialization during the early part of my career. And so I ended up, in some sense, just by accident, becoming an energy banker, but loved the industry from day one. It's a very interesting cross section between geopolitics and science and economics, and a lot of really interesting characters. And I always had great fun with it and was interested in it, and have continued to be over all these years. So I just ended up as an energy banker, and the firm was looking for someone to move to Houston to help get an investment banking practice started in Houston. Goldman Sachs did not have one there in those days. And I raised my hand and said, I'd like to do that. So after my first 4 years in New York, we moved to Houston, and I started working in the banking business in Houston for Goldman.
Yeah, and then after some time, you set out to develop your own firm, Tudor Partners, I guess it was initially. I heard you in another interview say a phrase which I think is just precious, that you saw dollars laying on the ground. And
Right.
to me, that's the definition of entrepreneurship. It's seeing opportunity out there and grasping at it. Obviously, it's not as easy as just picking them up. It's a lot of hard work and blood, sweat, and tears along the way. But talk a little bit about your creation of what became Tudor, Pickering, and Holt, a highly successful business in energy investment banking.
During my years at Goldman, I always felt I wanted to have a second chapter. Not that many people stay at Goldman for much longer than 20 years or so. That was about the time that I was there. And I was always very critical of the Goldman partners who retired young and then didn't do much. because you have a lot to offer. You're well trained. Typically, you have enough of a nest egg to do other things, and I wanted to do other things. And so after 5 years in London, my last 5 years at Goldman, I spent in London. And after those 5 years in London, I decided it was time to come back and make a break. And I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. I felt that there was room to build a specialist investment bank. It had been shown to be viable by other competitors, both in the energy world and in other sectors like technology or financial institutions. And so I had a vision of what that might look like, and I decided to go down that road. I thought there was a real commercial opportunity there, as you said, because of the combination of the commercial opportunity and my interest in being in Houston, Texas. I thought the conditions were right to try that. So I left Goldman and satisfied my non-compete, and then jumped into the business. And I had a very particular vision for what I thought the firm ought to look like. And in particular, I felt like it needed to have a high quality research component to it. And I found a great partner for that in Dan Pickering. Dan had started a business called Pickering Energy Partners. And so I teamed up with Dan, and then hired a former Goldman colleague, Maynard Holt, to join us. And so we launched Tudor Pickering Holt and Company in 2007, and off we went. And our timing ended up being quite propitious. Better lucky than good, as they say. And we were lucky because the shale revolution was happening in the energy business. The financial crisis was happening in the financial world, and that turned out to be very much actually in our favor. So it was a great set of circumstances. We got lucky in some ways, and we executed well in some ways, and it was just a fantastic 15-year experience for me.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that you set yourself up to take advantage of circumstances that came along. I sometimes hear young people in our programs who dismiss the success of entrepreneurs and want to attribute it entirely to luck. But you have actually had to work hard to develop a company to be in the position to take advantage of those circumstances. And part of, I know, what you did is built a company that had the right culture for success. And I'd love to talk with you a little bit about that, because I think that is so important, to have the right culture within a firm, within an organization, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. Could you talk about the culture of TPH that you created?
Yeah, we were really really focused on culture. The investment banking business is a people driven business. All you have are people. They're very limited assets. You have some office space and a few computers and people. And so the question is, how do you make money off your wits? Particularly in a people driven business, the culture of the place is critically important. And the nature of the investment banking business is also that it's in some sense it's more of an avocation than it is a vocation. You truly truly have to live it and breathe it. And that's because the things that you're working on for your clients are the most important things in their lives, right? They're either selling their company, they're buying another company, they're taking their business public, they're making a large acquisition. The things they're working on are really, really important to them. And they're paying you a lot of money to give them advice and service. And so you have to be 100% on 100% of the time. And so it's an exciting business, it's an interesting business, and it's a fun business, but it's also a very, very intense business. And so you have to be bought into that and willing to live with that. And my thesis was that if you had a great culture that was really fun, that was inspiring, that was collegial, you're going to be willing to kind of power through those difficult periods. And you were also going to be willing to stay with it longer. Part of the problem in the investment banking world is that people really do get burned out and don't stay with it. And often they leave before they've reached their maximum effectiveness, and before the job becomes really fun and interesting for them. And so we wanted to build a culture where people would want to stay and build long careers in the business. At the end of the day, culture in my mind is about how you treat each other. It's not a lot more complicated than that. It's about how you treat each other. And so one of the first things I did was I got out a notepad, and I wrote down our kind of key cultural components, our vision for the business, and what we wanted the culture to be. And we really tried very hard to live by that. And the firm still does. If you walk around the TPH offices in Houston, you'll see our cultural principles up on the wall. And every time we had a firm meeting, I talked about the culture. We read the points. They were very alive for us. And I think at the end of the day, it was a distinguishing factor for our business. When you ask young people why they decided to join TPH instead of Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or you name it, 9 out of 10 times it was not because, well, you guys work on the best deals or I want to be part of the leading energy M&A franchise. 9 out of 10 times it was because I was attracted to the culture. And that told me that it was working. And I think our culture did become widely recognized as being differentiated.
Now, I know growing up you were an athlete, I think a swimmer and a basketball player, and probably did other sports as well. By the time you were in high school, you were being recruited by large public universities, Ivy League schools, even Duke, who had just come off a national championship, wanted you. You ended up accepting an offer to go to Rice, strong academic institution, as well as a place where you excelled in basketball in your 4 years there. To what extent has sports influenced you in your business career?
Sports has had an enormous impact on my life. I was extremely consumed with it as a young person. My dad had been a college athlete, and I had a younger brother who was also a really outstanding athlete who played basketball at LSU. And to play sports at the Division I level, it really does take a lot of commitment, and so I was highly committed to it, but not to the exclusion of an academic career or other interests. And when it came time to choose a college, I wanted a place that offered the best of both. I wanted high level Division I athletics and really elite level education. And I felt like there were really a handful of places in the country that offered both of those things, at least in the way that I was looking for them. And decided on Rice, and it was a great choice for me. My college experience as an athlete was an excellent experience on the whole. It was very intense and difficult, but it was also really rewarding and satisfying and fun. I had a lot of fun doing it, and we had some success. And after Rice, I played professionally for 2 years in Europe. So it took me to places that I otherwise wouldn't have been. I learned a lot about leadership. As an athlete, I learned a lot about sacrifice. I learned a lot about teamwork, both good and bad. You learn what works, and you also learn what doesn't work. And those are lessons that I've certainly carried with me through my business career.
Were there challenging times at Goldman Sachs or when you were starting your business or building your business where you had to harken back to draw from that experience of commitment and teamwork and intense practice to find the strength to solve a problem or to move forward from a difficult situation?
Yeah, there are all sorts of examples of that, but I think sort of writ large, investment banking is a team sport. And one of the things that drew me to it was that you really do work in a team setting. No one does anything by themselves. And I always felt that whether in an academic setting or otherwise, I was best when working in a team as opposed to working by myself or on a solitary basis. And people are different that way. A lot of people much prefer to work by themselves, to work on a solitary basis, to do a project at a time and finish it and turn it in. I was one of those students that liked study groups. I always felt like I performed better if I could learn from others. There are other people in the world who hate study groups, right? They want to study by themselves.
Right.
And I think investment banking really does lend itself to people who love study group. Everything's a team. So that's part of what attracted me to banking in the first place. I think with regard to specific lessons, part of it is learning how to grind it out when you're tired and when you don't feel like it and when it's unpleasant, rather than, cutting your workout short, you finish and you try to finish strong. And that's critical in the investment banking world as well. There's a good chunk of the work that's not necessarily that fun or interesting, but you got to grind your way through and get it done. There's learning how to inspire other people, right? And there's learning how to complement your skill set with other skill sets. And I wasn't the best at everything in investment banking. I wasn't the best at everything in basketball, but I was good at certain things, and I would find teammates who were good at the other things, and then together we were effective. And so there were all sorts of lessons learned in my sports career that I think were highly applicable to my business career. And I continue to be, interested in sports and have fun being involved at Rice and their intercollegiate athletics programs. And it'll always be an important part of my life. That's for sure.
Before I shift gears and talk to you a little bit about another aspect of your life, which is the great amount of philanthropic activity you're involved in, I want to ask you one other question about investment banking. I think a lot of people, young people in particular, don't really know what investment banking is all about. And they probably easily dismiss it as, oh, that's where greedy people go to work. They don't know the role that it plays that's vital to a free economy and to a successful economy. Could you kind of give us a short understanding of what investment banking is all about?
Yeah. Investment banking is an umbrella term that's used to describe a very wide set of activities. And the big investment banks like Goldman Sachs, where I worked, tend to engage in a very broad set of financial activities, whether it's capital raising, sales and trading, investing on behalf of others, managing money, asset management, and advisory work. The more narrow definition of investment banking is what we did at TPH, which is advice. So we gave financial advice to corporations, and in particular, mergers and acquisitions advice, also capital raising advice. And we also gave investing advice to big institutional investors. So it was an advice driven business. And investment banks actually do play a really important role in the global financial system. They are really important players ultimately when it comes to working capital markets and working corporate markets around the world. So I was always very proud to be an investment banker. It was interesting work. It was fun work. I felt like I was making a difference in the lives of my clients and the companies and the shareholders. And I think investment banking is much maligned and misunderstood by many people. But I also think that, like in any industry, a few bad players can reputationally spoil the whole thing. And that can happen in the law, it can happen in politics, it can happen in medicine, and it happens in investment banking. So
Politics? No, never happens in
yeah,
politics.
not in politics, right? But investment banking tends to be quite high profile because there's a lot of money at stake, and it tends to be a lucrative profession as well. So I'm a very proud investment banker, and will absolutely stand by the industry as a valuable, if not even critical one to the world financial system.
Well, I suspect that your work at Tudor, Pickering, and Holt helped make our energy production much more efficient and lowered the costs of what Americans paid for energy for many decades because of the shale revolution and the investments that you were able to direct into efficient energy production. You said earlier that you wanted a second chapter to your career. I think you're on number 7, 8, or 9 by now,
Right.
but
Right.
chapter 3 perhaps was leaving Tudor, Pickering, and Howe and kind of staying in the energy area, but in a different direction. Could you talk some about what you're doing now with the sustainable energy, clean energy area?
One of the fun and interesting things about the energy world is it's very dynamic and changing, and that's been true for a long time. It's probably true more now than it has been, and so after 15 years at TPH, we merged the firm into Perella Weinberg Partners, a New York-based investment bank, and that combined business went public at the end of 2020. And so at the end of 2021, Maynard Holt and I, the two remaining founding partners, stepped down. And I have spent my time since stepping down leading something called the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, which which is an effort driven by the Greater Houston Partnership. And the Greater Houston Partnership is the primary economic development organization in Greater Houston. Think of it as the Houston Chamber of Commerce on steroids, if you will, a very CEO-driven organization. Almost all of our big companies here in Houston are members of this organization. And by definition, a lot of our companies are in the energy business. We have 25 Fortune 500 companies in Houston, the second most of any major metro in the country, and 19 of those 25 are from are from the energy world. And so we decided that here in Houston we needed a coordinated approach to the energy transition, because we recognize that there is both a responsibility that the incumbent industry plays in this transition and a fantastic opportunity to be a leader in the transition. And we want to make sure that we look up 2 decades from now and 3 decades from now in Houston, and Houston will continue to be the energy capital of the world. It's just that the energy systems in the world will actually likely look somewhat different in 2 or 3 decades from now. And so I've taken on a leadership position there. I'm the chairman of HEDI, of the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, and it's been fun and interesting. We're very involved in policy. And so, for example, in the whole area of carbon capture, use, and storage, which is really sort of important technological piece of the energy transition, there's a lot of policy that has to be sorted out before these big projects will get done. So we're involved in policy. We're involved in capital formation. We're involved in just connecting the dots for the companies. We're involved in the whole innovation ecosystem here. There's a ton of new company formation happening in energy transition related businesses, some of which are tied to the incumbent industry, some of which are not tied to the incumbent industry. So there's just a ton happening. I wanted to be right in the middle of all that. And HEDI is a great vehicle for me to do that. I'm also active as an investor in the space, and have now invested in 2 private companies who are energy transition related companies. And so it's fun and interesting and a whole new chapter, and it leverages off of what I've spent the previous 35 years doing, but is also new and interesting in many ways, and a lot of fun.
Do you see fossil fuels playing an important role in our energy production and consumption for at least a few more decades, or are we pushing?
Yeah.
Are we pushing too fast to?
Well, there's a balance here, right? And it's I describe it as a dual challenge. We have the challenge of providing reliable, affordable, and secure energy today, while simultaneously driving down CO2 and other emissions to combat the worst effects of climate change. And so we need to do both at the same time. We gotta walk and chew gum, as they say, and that means that the ongoing support and investment in the fossil fuel industry is not just desirable but necessary. But it also means that both the fossil fuel industry and emerging new technologies need to be increasingly focused on driving down their own industrial CO2 emissions footprint, and on working on new technologies that will allow us to produce more energy without CO2 emissions, at least on the scale that we currently have. So it's a big dual challenge. The incumbent industry is critical to it. We're not going to have an effective transition without the leadership of the incumbent industry, and I think the world has increasingly kind of figured that out. Actually, there's nothing like a war that dries up energy prices dramatically to remind people of the fact that the first part of this dual challenge, having reliable, affordable, and secure energy, is absolutely critical. And so finding the right balance there is important.
Now shifting to another chapter in your career, you've been very active as a member of the board at Rice, serving on a number of boards actually of programs at Rice. You've been chaired, I think, the Houston Symphony, been involved with MD Anderson and the Good Reason Houston program. How do you think that philanthropic spirit developed? I mean, is it something you grew up with in your own family? Is it something that comes when you have success in business and you're in a position where you can do those types of things? I'm interested in your motivations.
Well, I did grow up with it in my family. My parents were great examples in that regard. I grew up in this relatively small town in central Louisiana called Alexandria, and my parents were prominent citizens and leaders and very much engaged in the civic life of our town. So I kind of felt like that's what what you're supposed to do. I've always been drawn to leadership positions and have wanted to be in a position of leadership. And with leadership comes responsibility, and part of that responsibility is to work to try to make life better for those around you. And so I've wanted to be engaged in civic life, and certainly as I had more monetary success, it enabled me to be more impactful in some ways. But before that monetary success, and this is a message I give to young people all the time, is there are lots of ways to be impactful in civic life. It's not just philanthropically. And so I've tried very hard to both give both time and treasure and leadership and sort of my experience and skill sets to organizations of all types. And so my wife and I are very engaged across a wide set of things, not just in Houston, but in many cases nationally. And that ranges from public education to the arts to parks to libraries to civic organizations of all sorts. It's a really important part of our life. It makes life more fun and interesting. And I feel like I have a responsibility. I've been very fortunate and very blessed in many, many ways. And I have the capability to do it and the time to do it and the interest. And so we do it. And we do it with great enthusiasm and pleasure. And I think as you often hear, you get a lot more out of it than you put into it. If you'll feel really engaged in civic life, we certainly feel that way.
I imagine, just as you've probably seen in the business world, the for-profit world, you've seen examples of strong leadership and weak leadership. Probably seen that as well in the nonprofit sector. They exist there too, strong leaders, weak leaders. What kind of lessons have you learned from being a leader in the nonprofit sector in terms of how organizations could, operate more efficiently, accomplish their missions more effectively? Is it bringing in practices from the for-profit sector that are often lacking in a nonprofit environment? Is it the
Well, one,
culture?
one comment I'd make around that, Roger, is that, and this would be true both for nonprofits and for-profits, is that leadership can take many, many different forms, and not all leaders need to look and act and behave alike. That's certainly one lesson that I've learned. On the other hand, I think there are some common threads in leadership, and one is that you need to be able to inspire others. And that tends to be more by example than by your words, but words do matter. And I think the words that come out of a leader's mouth matter more often than the leader knows. And so being careful about what you say and how you say it really does matter. We talked earlier about culture. I would say the nonprofits that I've been around that are the most successful and the most effective in their mission, usually, like for-profit companies, have great culture. They promote collegiality, they promote teamwork, they reward the right things, and they punish the right things. And that's true in the not-for-profit world, and it's true in the for-profit world. Another common thread between successful organizations, I think, is a belief fundamentally in a mission, and I think that's true whether you're working in an investment bank or working at an arts institution or at a social services agency or in higher education. You really need to be truly bought in and committed to the mission of your organization and the difference that you're trying to make in the world. And so the very best not-for-profit leaders and organizations that I see are really bought into their mission. They live it and breathe it every day, and they build great culture around it.
Well, that's a great set of advice there for leaders in all sectors. Thank you for sharing it. I know we're running up on our time limit, but I one last question I'd like to ask guests. We've put an emphasis more recently, not just on developing leaders, but developing what we call courageous leaders. And it obviously you've had times in your career where you've had to exercise courageous leadership, because sometimes the decisions you make aren't easy to make. There's stress behind them, anxiety, but you have to make that right decision. Do you have any thoughts you could share that maybe would be applicable to young people attending our programs today about the importance of courage in your career or courageous leadership?
In my mind, courageous leadership is highly tied to two things: is to knowing and understanding yourself, and to being empathetic towards others. And more often than not, things that are decisions that are difficult are very often difficult because of your own fear, right? Whether it's fear of failure or fear of something else, and or they're difficult because you kind of don't have a full and empathetic understanding for other people and for the organization as a whole. When you're a leader of an organization, you're both serving the organization writ large, and you're serving the individuals in it. And so, kind of fully understanding that and getting your head around that, ultimately, I think will lead to good decisions. But you got to know yourself, and you got to know what comes naturally for you and what you're good at. And you also need to know what your weaknesses are, and you need to recognize them, and you need to face up to them. And I think people who have a lack of sort of that self understanding, often stumble when faced with big, difficult decisions. And so, as Shakespeare said, "Know thyself."
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate so much you being our guest today, Bobby. Thank you for your generous support of the Fund for American Studies. It's great to have an opportunity to talk to a real leader, not only in the business and investment world, a leader in your community and the philanthropic sector. You are someone who we're proud to call an alum, and appreciate all you've done and wish you the best going forward.
Well, thank you, Roger, and thanks for the work that you and the fund do and educating young people and developing leaders. It's really, really important. I'm proud to be a TFAS alum and happy to support the organization. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I would be remiss in not mentioning we enjoy coming back down to Rice in the summer for our high school program. It's a great venue. Students love it, so we're grateful to that as well. My guest today has been Bobby Tudor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Liberty and Leadership Podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe, download, like, or share the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you like this episode, I ask you to rate and review it. And if you have a comment or question for the show, please drop us an email at podcast@tfas.org. The Liberty and Leadership Podcast is produced at K Global Studios in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Roger Ream, and until next time, show courage in things large and small.